Thank you for inviting me to the organization, and thank you for your questions in regards to support services and what support services is and what it does, as well as how did they get formed and why did they get formed. So, and I do apologize, I was informed that the meeting had been canceled. So I was on my way home to lunch. But I'm glad to be here. So the questions that I received in regards to the support services department from the organization was to describe the Department of Support Services, describe the role and responsibilities within support services, to whom does the Director of Support Services report to, what are the specific responsibilities regarding the development and oversight of the county budget, what portion of the general fund is support services, and does support services have any responsibility for the total overall Mason County budget? And let me interject here, if there's any questions that come up during the presentation, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll attempt to answer it as we move along. So, support services manages the budget and the budget process. It incorporates human resources, which includes labor relations and union negotiations. Under human resources, it also manages the Board of Equalization, manages the risk for the county, civil service, and the LEF program, which is a medical coverage program for retired sheriff's deputies. It also controls and manages the central operations, which is the board support for Mason County Board of Commissioners. Facilities and grounds, which is predominantly building maintenance. Parks and trails, which is recreation and grant management for recreations, parks, and the county trails. Emergency management, where it coordinates with local, state, and federal groups. Information technology, IT, which manages all the software, hardware, infrastructure, and computers throughout the county. It, by default, manages what is called non-departmental. Those would be expenses that aren't related to any other specific department within the county. Things like our insurance policy, things like dues for Association of Counties. We pay our state auditor bill out of there and a number of other non-departmental types of expenditures, as well as managing the transfer of funds. So the current expense transfers to the health department funds to supplement the health department costs, as well as roads transfers back to current expense costs to cover IT, roads, and other operational costs. So we manage the transfer of those dollars. And then also commissioner administration, which would be assisting the commissioners in putting their agendas together and any research that they may ask for. Yes?
Did we hire anybody to replace John Keats in Parks, or was that, okay, so that...
And I'll get into that in
Okay.
a couple of slides, but yes. So to specifically answer some of the questions that were brought forward, the Director of Support Services reports to the Board of County Commissioners, as does the other two directors. Directors for Community Services and the Director for Public Works and Utilities. So each of those three directors report directly to the board. The Director of Support Services oversees the operation of the county budget process, not the distribution of dollars. In the absence of a budget manager, the Director of Support Services has filled the role of the budget manager. Previously, the Director acted as the budget manager. So I came up through the ranks as the budget manager for the current expense and under the board. And then when I was promoted to the Director of Support Services and we lost our budget manager, I, through attrition, became the budget manager and managed that component for the 2018 budget preparation.
When did that happen? That we lost our budget manager?
Don't hold me to it, June of 2017 or July, somewhere in there. So that's how I ended up with the development of the budget.
Is that a
in this
permanent
way.
reorganization?
No. We are right now in the process of going out to hire for a replacement budget manager. So in July, it didn't make sense to hire a brand-new budget manager when we were stepping into the budget process. It would have just been too confusing. So we decided not to hire that position until we got through the budget process. The Director of Support Services is directly responsible for about $8 million of the county current expense budget. So each of those departments have a component of the county budget. Combined, they represent about $8 million. As manager of the budget process, the department is responsible for the development of the entire county budget. So as a budget manager, and as I've identified, the budget manager puts the process of how we develop the budget together, manages the process of organizing the work sessions and disseminating the information in regards to where the budget stands at any point in time.
Right.
Yes.
It says that the director of support oversees the operation, but does not have any authority of distribution of dollars. And then it says that you are directly responsible for $8 million in the county current expense budget. Do you yourself have any budget authority whatsoever?
What do you mean by budget authority? I have about $8 million worth of adopted budget authority for the departments that are in support services.
Right, but that budget authority to give you the $8 million comes from the county commissioners.
Strictly.
I'm sorry?
Strictly.
Right.
Only. So the county commissioners is the entity that determines what the allocation for the adopted budget will be. So they will dictate and say the assessor gets X dollars when they adopt their budget and so forth.
Does any other county have a support services department that you're aware of?
Quite a few, and it may not be called support services, it may be called financial services, it may be called a myriad of other names, but there's a centralized operation that generally manages the support of the other elected officials and other departments as it relates to infrastructure of computers, infrastructure of centralized services to the board, and sometimes even payroll is under that centralized function. But, so to answer your question, yes, there are other counties that have that.
Do you have the authority to decide how that $8 million is distributed amongst
Within the
those?
guidelines of the budget, yes. So within HR, there's a budget allocated to that. I cannot exceed that budget, but within that budget, I have the authority to manage that budget, yes.
But you couldn't take money from parks and move it over to facilities? Okay.
So the way the budget is adopted in Mason County, and there's a budget document which is on the website, which is the detailed budget. But in December, there is a one-page line by department and elected by elected, a dollar amount that's approved for each of the, a dollar amount that's approved as the adopted budget, which each of the departments are allowed to expend. So one of the questions was, why was support services created? In order to answer that, you need to understand where Mason County was. And previously, Mason County, the hierarchy of the management of Mason County is as follows. It started off with the voters. They voted in the elected officials for each of the departments, for the clerk, the assessor, the auditor, treasurer, and district court and superior court judges, prosecuting attorney. I think I covered everybody. In addition, the board then has under its control each of these departments. It has WSU, Public Health, Community Development, Public Works, Utilities and Waste Management, Budget, Finance and Risk, Central Operations, Human Resources, Trails and Parks, and Facilities and Grounds. These departments go back to, I think, 2008, where each one of these departments had a director. So back in '08, the county had 10 directors, and we'll get into the makeup of management of the county in just a few slides. But that's how the county was organized previously. And here's a visual representation of what that looks like. So the voters voted in all of the, I'm sorry, sheriff was the one I left off. The voters voted in all of the elected officials, including the Board of Commissioners, and the commissioners then managed those 10 departments, each of whom had at least a director and a manager of some kind. So why was support services created? Originally, the state auditor had a finding which required the need to move the Department of Emergency Management out of Public Works. Public Works, being funded by road funds, should not have been used as the funding source for Department of Emergency Management. State auditor came back to the county and asked that we move that out of the roads fund. It also asked that the Information Technology Department, which was under what's called ER&R, that's an Equipment Rental Revolving Fund. Roads has a department that they buy equipment, materials, and trucks to manage the maintenance of the roads and to manage the construction of new roads within the county. Previously, the management of the county included information technology in that department. Now, information technology assisted not only roads, but managed all the computers and the software and the hardware for the entire county. And as such, the state auditor said it cannot be solely funded by roads dollars. So the state auditor started off by saying those two departments needed to be put somewhere else. Another reason for the restructuring was the cash reserves were depleted. Back in '08, we ended up in a very similar situation to what we had last year, which was that the budgeting process had depleted cash reserves to a point where current expense barely had enough cash on hand to make March payroll. So state auditor findings plus the depletion of cash required that the county restructure and reorganize its operations. It needed to balance the general fund budget, and there are basically only three ways to accomplish that: increase revenues, reduce expenditures, or use reserves to fund balances. So the county had been, for a few years prior to that, using its reserves to fund the general fund. And when the reserves got down to a point where there were no more reserves, it needed to do something to restructure and reorganize its operations. So the options to resolve the SAO finding was to restructure DEM, Department of Emergency Management, IT, so that it no longer is funded by road funds. But putting it into current expense exasperates the cash flow problem or the cash reserve problem. IT spends about $400,000, $500,000 a year, and DEM spends about $200,000, $250,000. So putting it into current expense created a bigger problem. Now I have more expenses and not enough funds to pay for those. So that precipitated the requirement to reorganize and restructure the administration of those operations under the control of the County Board of Commissioners. They decided to create one department to manage all of the county support services, which was to say to combine support departments into one to include DEM and IT, which consolidated the support operations for all departments and the offices of the elected officials. So what the commissioners decided to do is to take all of the supporting functions within the county, HR, IT, DEM, risk management, and put it under one department within their purview. The options to resolve the state auditor finding continues in that they reduced the 10 directors to 3, which impacts costs and creates more centralized management and structure. So what they did was they combined the works and utilities, public works and utilities and waste management into one department with one director. They combined public health and community development into one department under community services. And then they combined all of the centralized support services department under one department called support services.
Did this save money?
I'll get to that in just a second.
Okay.
Options to increase cash revenues. Remember, there were 2 reasons. One was because of the state auditor, and the second was to increase cash reserves. So again, we defined that there are only 3 ways to increase cash reserves. One is to increase revenues. The county has a limited capacity to raise taxes unilaterally. And another is to increase fees, which has a limited capacity to impact revenues. So in other words, raising fees in county parks by 2 or 3% brings maybe $30,000 to the revenue stream of Mason County, which isn't anywhere close to being enough to manage the shortfalls that we're seeing last year and a couple of years ago, as well as back in '08. Reduce expenditures. The largest portion of the current expense costs are salaries and benefits, generally greater than 7%. Material cost savings achieved by reorganizing or restructuring consolidated administration and management is another reduction of operations. And as a matter of fact, that was a 2011 League of Women Voters budget study recommendations that there be a consolidation of administration and management, as well as defined service level reductions. In both cases, back in '08 and just recently, one of the precipitants from having a reduction of expenditures, predominantly in staff, required that most offices look at the level of service that they're offering to the citizens and had to dial back those levels of services in either hours served or numbers of staff that can serve the public at any specific point in time. The third way was to use reserve balances to balance the budget. But using reserves are useful only for one-time expenditures, not routine, ongoing expenses. Once you spend your reserve, that reserve is gone, and it won't come back. So attempting to use your reserve to cover salary increases, for instance, is not a prudent method of budgeting.
Hey, Frank, can I ask you here?
Sure.
When we were looking at this back in 2011, one of the things that we found was that many, just by example, many offices were going to pick up mail. So it was like you had several people from the county making trips over. So has something like that been consolidated?
Yes.
Well, that's good.
Currently, they're all in one location. And there's one central repository for distribution of mail, so that everybody comes to drop their mail off and or to pick up their mail. And we're using enterprise services from the state to process our mail as well.
Question? Do you have a breakout on the 70% for costs of salaries and benefits? How much is direct salary and how much is benefit?
Yes, we do. I don't have it in the adopted budget, but the details in the minutia, but I have a mechanism within our new accounting software to specifically ask for that level of detail.
I'd be interested in how that compares with a similar breakout in other counties, particularly with the discussion ongoing about city commissioner benefits.
To give you an answer, our current benefit factor is roughly around 32%. I don't know what that looks like against other counties, but it has a dramatic impact on departmentally how that percentage relates, and I'll explain why. A department that has low salaries or has a number of individuals that are at the lower end of the pay scale have fixed medical costs. And the fixed medical costs relative a salary of say $40,000 or $50,000 is a pretty high percentage. So in those departments, it may exceed 40%. Other departments where there are a larger contingent of higher salaried individuals, Public Works might be an example, that percentage is less than. But overall, an average for the county is somewhere between 30 and 32%.
I'm interested that you talked about relatively low income and then said 40 or 50,000. That's considerably higher than the average household income in the county,
I don't know,
isn't it?
I think the county's average household income is 54,000, and that was a couple of years ago, so I don't know what it is exactly today. I looked at, or I recall that coming out of the Office of Financial Management, but I could look that up and find out. There are a number
I
of
remember
them.
it to be at least only 39,000.
Something like that,
That was the
yeah.
average. in Mason
You're talking about
County.
average or median?
Yeah.
I'm talking median,
That's different.
yeah. Average is maybe, it may be at that level. But we can look that up.
And in these 70%, does that include retirement benefits, for retired employees?
Yes. Yes. So options to increase cash revenues. Use of fund balance has reduced general fund cash reserves below levels that are required by prudent cash management, to levels below what is necessary to be able to pay bills. The citizens of Mason County have continually said to the county that the government should live within its means. Therefore, increasing revenues at this time is not an option. The majority of current county expenditures for salaries and benefits, thereby making it the only viable option to deal with cash shortfalls. And when I say only, that's a relative term. There are cost efficiencies that can be had in every department, but the major component of the cost reductions occurs predominantly as an adjustment to staffing levels.
And when you say adjustment to staffing level, you're assuming that the salary benefit packages stay the same and we lose people.
That is correct. The CBA's collective bargaining agreements, reversing those gains are very, very difficult, if possible at all.
And how many unions do you have, how many bargaining units do you have now?
12. So the only option available to the county was to restructure the departments under control of the Board of the County Commissioners.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I would take a little bit of exception for the only option available in either of the last two cases, seeing that this situation, the financial situation that we came in, didn't occur within 18 months, it occurred within almost 10 years.
Twice, within 10 years.
Yeah, and so it wasn't a sudden occurrence. As your job, because you didn't really, you're not a county administrator, but you make recommendations to the county commissioners that there is a cliff approaching, and I've seen you do that several times. But since you don't have any direct budget authority, do you think that it impacted your decisions, your position, the way it's described impacted your decisions? Because I know you saw the problem coming a long time before it got here.
I've defined the problem for a number of years. So the question was, did it impact my decisions?
Did it impact the way your recommendation to the county, since considering your position doesn't have any real authority like a county administrator?
It did. And how it did was by presenting to the commission on a number of occasions the cliff we were facing. So back in, don't hold me to it, 2015 I think it was, or maybe it was 14, we had a revenue, a briefing or a longer meeting in regards to the need to look at increasing revenues, given the growth of the results of salary increases due to CBA negotiations, that we need to take a look at what those revenue increases should be and plan for those. We also had, and I believe we had that twice, and currently I'm bringing forward, well actually there's a couple of slides in here that addresses some of that, which is to say we have a balanced budget resolution currently. We're also looking at developing strategic planning, longer-term strategic planning for the county, as well as to include financial strategic planning for the county. So there's a number of things that are in this presentation that address your question.
The point I wanted to make is that revenue increases were an absolute. Several years ago, we saw that revenue increases, despite what citizens say they want, prices are increases on goods and services on all other areas in the private sector. Of course, they're going to increase in the public sector. So I guess my question is, why wasn't there more of a push to at least sell that accurate information to the public, rather than wait till we were standing on the edge of the cliff and then throw something together in the way of
I couldn't answer that. All I can answer is that at least 2 or 3 times, Bill Keddy, the predecessor director, had a presentation discussing that issue. I also brought forward one, at least one, if not 2. So it should not have been. It should not have been that much of a surprise to anybody.
But you know what has happened here that we've seen, looking at it over the long run, is that when the county got in trouble last time, they came up with a resolution or a plan to increase the cash reserves.
But they didn't balance, that did not include a balanced budget component.
That, and we'll see how this goes. But my humble opinion on this is that what you have is every couple of years, you're getting new commissioners in. And then you go through that learning curve. And that's quite a learning curve that's going on here.
That's why I believe that the balanced budget resolution will go a long way to addressing the need for that learning curve, in that they will not be allowed to use reserves to balance the budget.
But they can just change the resolution, Frank.
Then they can, yes.
Yeah.
But then they're impacting the process of budgeting to the negative as opposed to putting a balanced resolution forward, which impacts the budgeting process to the positive.
Or just ignore the resolutions?
They can't. The state auditor would come down and give them a finding.
I think we've seen where they've ignored resolutions before.
They can. They can ignore them, but the state auditor would come in and say, there's a finding here because you overspent your reserves or you used your reserves to fund current expense budgets.
I hope you're right.
So, understanding the results of the modified hierarchy for the county government, if you remember this, which is to say we had 10 departments under the board with 10 separate directors. What they changed was there are now 3 departments under the board with only 3 directors. And this is what that looks like. So you have voters electing in the elected officials, and under the board now you have community services, which was public health and community development. You have public works and utilities, which was public works and utilities and waste management, and then you had support services with its myriad of different departments, risk, budget, human resources, and so forth. Without getting into big dollars and cents and comparing budgets, I thought it was more prudent to look at staffing levels. So these were the staffing levels in the 2008 budget, and I make a distinction there because what's budgeted for and what occurs actually are 2 different things. So under the 2008 budget, the elected officials had 13 elected officials. They had 5 under their command staff. They had 1 deputy assigned to the elected offices. They had 1 commissioner, 3 administrators, 2 managers, and 196 full-time employees, representing 221 staff. Under the current hierarchy, and this is under the 2018 budget, there are 14 electeds, an increase of 1. There are 7 under the command staff, an increase of 2. There are 2 deputies, an increase of 1. Commissioners stayed the same. Administrators increased by 1 to 4, and managers stayed the same. The FTEs dropped by roughly 30 employees to 190, to a total of 196 employees. And that represents an about 11% reduction in staff. The prior hierarchy of the county government, which included public health, community services, public works, utilities, ER&R, and WSU, represented 5 directors, 3 deputy directors, 10 managers, 167 FTEs for a total of 185 employees. The current hierarchy drops 3 directors, keeps the deputy directors' numbers the same, reduces managers by 2, and reduces full-time equivalents by 44, dropping the staffing level to 136, which represents about a 27% reduction. The prior hierarchy of county support services, which included the Board of Equalization, budget, risk, facilities, human resources, central ops, parks and trail, DEM, and information technology. Previously, those were all separate departments, had 5 directors, 4 managers, 29 FTEs, and a total of 38. Currently, there's 1 director, no deputy directors. There are 4 managers still, although they're spread amongst more departments, and FTEs are just under 17 employees for a total of 22. Represents a reduction of 16, which is about a 42% reduction in staffing levels. for support services.
It seems to me the point also needs to be made, these are not just body losses, but expertise. And this is certainly not a slap at you, it's simply that I know that you are probably not an expert in park and trail management.
Not an expert, no.
And I wonder what this says about knowledgeable administration of departments that seem to have been marginalized.
Parks and Trails, I may agree with you there. Human Resources, IT, definitely budget, central operations. So in the other areas, there is a level of retaining what I would call corporate knowledge with the staff that we do have.
I also think about public health.
There, we have a director who comes from the public health field. So he has an extensive background in that. Public Works, we also have a director that has had extensive background in utilities and waste management. And they do have additional support as managers under those departments. I also have support in Parks and Trails. We have a number of individuals that have been in Parks and Trails, one individual or two, their entire career. So I use them as resources in specifically Parks and Trails. But I've had extensive background in information management, as well as human resources and as well as budget. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. You can't continue to hire the individuals, maintain the staffing levels that you've been accustomed to, so you reorganize in a way that is meaningful and can be managed by the remaining staff.
Okay. And so it seems like a system that's dependent for good operation on the individual people hired more than the structure itself.
True. So the net impact of the overall budget is that they reduced directors by 7, from 10 to 3. The management staff in the elected offices were increased by 5. The management staff in the departments was reduced by 2. The overall FTE count was reduced by 95, which represents a savings of about $7 million in salaries and benefits for that staffing level reduction.
$7 million in 2008 dollars? Or
$18.
And $18.
2018 dollars.
Okay.
So since 2000, and that's why I picked 2 points in time where generally the same things were going on, 2008 and 2018. So the reduction that occurred in 2008 was in 2008 dollars of the 7 million. But then the staffing levels started to increase again, which then precipitated the same problem we had prior to 2008, which was to drive up the expenditure cost in the county because of the increased staffing levels, as well as general drivers of expenditures. Copier costs increased, paper costs increased. Almost everything in the county generally increases on a year-to-year basis at around 3.5% or 3.7% over a 7 or 8 year analysis, and the revenues were only increasing about 2.2%. So that gap kept eating away at the reserves that had been established back in '08 and then again just recently.
So top line, revenue increased from 2008 to 2018 by how much?
2.2%.
Give me a dollar.
Oh,
Is it about 10 million? About
A
11?
little less than 10 million, I think.
So you spent, and it's the commissioners, okay? Because they are the budget, they have the budget control. They make these decisions. So they spent 7 million plus 10 million, or about that, without knowing that the alarm should be going off? Because our cash balance this time last year was at a critical point also.
That's correct.
Well, that's pretty.
Which precipitated the
That's
reductions.
pretty big.
That's a year. So last year it was 6 million. The year before it was 5 million. That's a year.
Frank,
Yes.
are you making a statement that our budget without the overall impacts of the sports services would have been $43 million for 2018?
The statement I'm making here is that had we maintained the staffing levels
Right.
at where they were, so the assumption there is no support services. All the departments are still there, all the directors, all of the staff, and everybody else is still there. The statement I'm making here is that this year's budget would have been $7 million higher.
Or $43 million, or $43
Correct.
million. Okay, thank you.
So, additional improvements to managing the budget. And this is where you were, Tom, you were going in regards to your question. Improvements needed to manage the Mason County budget. The county needs to establish budgetary guidelines in the request by the board for the preliminary budget.
Where's the
They
enforced part? Where's the enforced part?
They currently do outline budgetary guidelines, and this last time around, they included a document that said, this is how much we think we can afford in our budget. So they actually gave a department by department projection of costs for the preliminary budget, for establishing the preliminary budget. The county needs to develop a strategic plan to define those guidelines. The county needs to convene a citizens committee to review the budget process and recommend revenue and expenditure changes. Understand the impact of state mandates regarding funded, underfunded, and unfunded mandates. That's a critical component. The county has no real insight into what the costs are for state mandated processes and operations, and no less how much of that is funded for, by what mechanism, and what are those mandates that are underfunded and in many cases unfunded entirely. The auditor had a request by the state for increasing election boxes throughout the county, and absolutely no dollars were made available to her, to the auditor, for any of those expenditures. And there are a myriad of those throughout the county operations. So we've started an analysis, or will be starting an analysis, of what those mandates are, what revenues we have receiving towards them, and where are the gaps in the funding for those.
When you say the county doesn't understand, are you talking about the people, the board, the staff, everybody?
D, all of the above.
Okay.
Lewis County embarked on a venture to do an in-depth analysis of that, and we're going to piggyback on top of that to take that to our county government and to create a report that tells us what those are, and then also to go back to the citizens to inform them of how the state operates, which is in many cases to require the county to do A, B, C, and D without any funding mechanism for that.
Will that analysis include how we're doing at meeting each of those mandates?
Interesting. That was not something that was a part of that analysis, but it is meaningful.
I would like to see that.
And it is meaningful, is to say what the results of that are. And how well do we or don't we meet those mandates?
For instance, voter boxes, and that, are we,
Just
is
from,
there a pattern to our meeting and not
yeah,
meeting?
just from my review, if you would, or my understanding, we generally are very responsive to mandates. How well we do is a different question. So that's a very good point. Passed a balanced budget resolution, so resolution number 5817 in October of 2017 established a balanced budget component, which is to say expenditures will never exceed revenues, excluding beginning fund balance and ending fund balance. So regardless of how much money you have in reserve, you will not use beginning fund balance to balance the current year's expenditures. And there is a caveat in there, which is to say, unless you have a plan to meet it next year. And so there are times where there are large expenditures that go over a 2-year cycle, where we may this year have to expend expenditures above revenues. But if we go to a biennium budget, then a 2-year budget, then that would have to be addressed in the next year's budget cycle. And establish goals to increase revenue balances, which were also done in the resolution 5817, and I'll define those later in the presentation. And this is one thing that I've been attempting to put forward, which is to say that we need to develop measurable outcomes for all elected officials and departments. That would be a 1 or 2 measurable, defined measurable item that we can look at, we, the departments and the board, can look at to define the value of increasing budgets, the value of increasing staffing levels, and can evaluate the efficiency and the effectiveness of what changes were made to the budget to see whether or not it concluded what it was we were hoping the change was going to do. So picking up the first one, that establish budgetary guidelines and the request for the BMCC by the board for preliminary budget. In preparation of the 2018 preliminary budget, the board held a revenue brainstorming meeting in 2017 with the electeds and department heads to establish areas of emphasis for the budgeting process. And in that, they defined the areas of emphasis, which is to say land use and development regulations, define the capital facility plan process, review adequacy of current jail facilities, evaluate the transition to the biennial budget, review public benefit rating system, review countywide policy implementation, and to review the options to mitigate the Belfair Sewer financial shortfalls. So those were the priorities that were set forward in the call for the budget in 2017 for the 2018 budget. Develop a strategic plan. Here are a guidance and outline of how we would go about to develop a strategic plan. We had a meeting with the electeds and the department heads a few weeks ago to present a proposal to have a strategic plan committee formed. The electeds went back, and we will have another meeting in a month and a half or so to determine the buy-in by the electeds and the other department heads in structuring a committee, an internal committee to do strategic planning.
How does that tie in with the comprehensive plan that was just revised?
Strategic plan should be there before a comprehensive plan is evaluated and developed. And they should be cohesive. So a strategic plan looks at what you want to be, how you want to get there. And the comp plan defines the process. We need to do this, we need to develop this, we need to make these changes. Here's the overarching plan for the GMAs or for the different components of the comp plan. So the two of them should be married and become a component of an equally important component in developing a guideline for where the county wants to go. I won't go into the details, it's about how to design the strategic plan. The other item that came out of the conversation with the electeds and department heads about a month ago was to convene a citizens committee to establish a committee to advise the board on budgetary priorities and efficiencies with improvements to service delivery, perform an overall assessment of county services and customer satisfaction. I guess that would be the component that you were asking for as to what the effectiveness of these budget changes might be. Developing actions to be taken with regard to revenues, defining opportunities to better manage expenditures and expenditure growth by examining revenue options and expenditure necessities, examining the effect of funded, unfunded, and underfunded mandates, defining financial drivers of revenues and expenditures. That's also a critical component, because understanding where your revenues come from and what impacts them makes a big difference in how you budget for it. One of the areas where the county found cash shortfalls is in Department of Natural Resource revenues. So Mason County as a rural county has in the past received fairly high revenue streams from the Department of Natural Resources for stumping fees and tree cuttings, which had over the last couple of years continued to diminish. So as the county became more dependent on those, which are not revenue streams that are reliable and or continually grow, but fluctuate, we became exposed to the fluctuation of those revenues, and that was one of the big drivers over the last couple of years. We saw revenues declining in the Department of Natural Resources, excise taxes and revenues from there. So understanding the drivers behind the revenues is important. Establishing recommendations for a sustainable budget. And that, I think, is the most critical component of what that committee can come back to the commission with. So understanding the impact of state mandates. Embark on a process of reviewing all state mandates, establish the levels of funding for those, determine which ones are underfunded or unfunded. Add to that what grants we do have and or are available to supplement the funding for mandates. Establish an alternative funding source for under and unfunded mandates, and establish for priorities of revenues in excess of mandates. My suspicion is that we're going to have revenues that aren't anywhere near enough to cover the mandates, but find out what that number is. Yes?
What are we doing in the county that may not be a mandated function?
Almost all of support services is not mandated, but none of the departments can exist without an IT structure. None of the departments can exist without HR. So those types of support structures are not, quote, mandated. And then there are a number of other unmandated services within each of the departments, and this analysis will define what those are. I wouldn't venture a guess into what those might be at this point. But we should understand what those are, and at the end of that analysis, we will.
Yeah, because I was looking at central operations, and I noticed that the commissioners don't have any employees under them, but then their employees would be under central operations, is that correct?
Well, their employees are under the public health and community services,
Okay.
as well as all of public works and utilities and waste management, as well as support services.
So who works in central operations?
That would be Diane, the clerk of the board, and the receptionist. So that's an old department from eons ago, where those individuals, I believe they were under the direct supervision of the board.
Yeah, because it looks like there's central operations now, a total of 5 employees, and central operations before, total of 5. So those
So-
are the same employees?
Yes. No, actually, under central ops, it would be Diane, central ops manager, clerk of the board, receptionist. I'd have to go back to the details. I don't recall what the other two would be. So, next item was to pass a balanced budget resolution. The board passed Resolution 5817 in October of 17, and it requires that expenditures not exceed revenues, excluding beginning and ending fund balances, eliminates the option of using reserves to balance the budget, avoids budgetary overspending, maintains a higher level of reserves, and eliminates potential for cash shortfalls due to overspending. It also established goals to increase reserve balances. So the goal previously of the board was to maintain a 9 to 12% reserve for budgetary purposes. This resolution brings that up to 12 to 15, from 12 to between 12 to 15%, and with the goal of increasing it up to 25%. 25% is a standard rule of thumb to have in your reserves 3 months' worth of operating cash. Established a contingency reserve, it's a rainy day fund, of $1 million. Established a technology reserve of at least $100,000. It established a general fund equipment and vehicle reserve, as well as accrued leave reserve to cover the expenditures for paying out accrued leave for retiring and departing employees. The only reserve that we had in the past was the operating reserve of between 9 and 12%. Yes.
Yeah, can you say something about the contingency reserve? What kinds of situations would that cover?
A landslide.
Okay,
A huge fire.
okay.
Emergency types of conditions, a tsunami of some sort. It's the West Coast.
Do we have that in our 2018 budget?
Not yet. The reserve levels are expected to increase between now and 2023. So the commission gave themselves 5 years to accumulate those reserves. When we did this analysis back in October, I believe it was 2022 before we were able to attain a 1%, I'm sorry, the $1 million contingency reserve. Because the expenditures in 2017 weren't as high as they were anticipated, that brought the reserve balance this year higher than what we considered it was going to be. That brought that $1 million reserve attainment down to somewhere around 2020. So
So we didn't have that reserve, we spent it?
we never did have the reserve. These are new reserves.
Okay.
So we never had $1 million reserve in excess of the general fund operating reserve.
What was the the general fund operating reserve at the end of 2017? What percent was it?
About $4 million, just a little over 9%.
This all strikes me a little bit like a family earning minimum wage being told, well, you really ought to set aside college money for your kids, and oh, you've got to take out long-term health care insurance, and you know you want to buy a house, so let's establish a bank account for a mortgage. And
Establishing some base level of, I know I'm going to pay $4 million in accrued leave in the next 20 years. We need to establish some reserves to be able to accommodate that.
but what do you do if you're living on minimum wage and barely making it? 39% of the county residents are at an income at or below what's required for minimum needs.
believe
That-
that's higher number than 30%, but we can argue that.
Jim Morrell was talking about Alice, which are
Mhm.
income limited employed. And he said 39% in the county, it's
39. I thought it was-
48 or something in the city.
Mhm. So we have to abide by, we, the county, should abide by those types of controls in spending, which is to say, I know I'm going to spend money on reserves. I know I'm going to have to buy vehicles for the county and for the sheriff's office. I know I'm going to spend money to improve our technology and computerized infrastructure. So why not put money aside for that and have those funds available when we need them?
So I want to say this, the county budget and the managers of the county budget are different from those in a household. If you're taking care of somebody else's money, that level of responsibility that you have just went up. You have a fiduciary responsibility. So what I want to suggest here is we're going to have a commissioner election this year. And these are the kind of questions we ought to be asking of those candidates. Are you going to support this or not? And get them on record. Where do you stand on this? Because I'm telling you, they tried to do this about 10 years ago and they couldn't do it. There was always a reason why they couldn't do it. And so it's like, Groundhog's Day. So it's going to keep on happening. But the only time that we have a voice, and I'm speaking to the choir here, the only time we have a voice is when they're up there trying to get elected. And that's when we need to ask those questions.
Frank, could you make the distinction and the relationship between the ending fund balance and the reserve fund? Because there always seems to be some confusion as the ending fund balance becomes the reserve fund, especially at the end of the budget year, not including the 13 months.
She hit it on the nose. I have a checking account. Every month I put money into it from my pay. At the end of the month, I have a balance, hopefully, of some dollars. So I'm going to say to myself, I'm going to buy a car, or I'm hoping to buy a car. I'm going to take $500 this month, assuming I have it there, and I'm going to put it into my savings account so that I have a reserve set aside so I can buy my car. I also need to pay for my kids' education. So I'm going to put funding into a Roth IRA or an education fund, where I'm going to fund my, Washington State education program that they had. The GET program. My kids went through that and used that funding for their college education. So those are conscious decisions. So the ending fund balance is what I have left at the end of my checking account. Either I take it out of there and put it somewhere else and say, this is a special fund for reserve for accrued leave, which is what they used to have. State auditor doesn't like us to do that. So we keep it in the checking account at the end of the month. But the process that we've defined in the resolution for balanced budget says at the end of each year, you will allocate out of what's left in your checking account $1 million to cover the reserve, X dollars to cover vehicles that you need to purchase, X dollars that you need for IT development, and so forth. So what you ended up with when $7 million worth of cash in our checking account really got reduced by $1 million to $6 million, got reduced by $500,000 for IT, got reduced by another $700,000 for vehicle purchases. So you end up with $3 million in cash at the end of the year. That then becomes your operating reserve. That $3 million should be enough to pay for 3 months' worth of your expenditures. Well, currently, that should be $5 million. Last year, we ended up with $4 million. So we're $1 million short towards meeting our 15% goal. We're another $1 million short of meeting our 25% goal.
Over 5 years.
Over 5 years. So what that means is that we're going to have to be prudent budgeting, to follow prudent budgeting guidelines, to say we may have money left at the end of the year, we cannot spend it for this project, that project, or another project, we have to keep it in reserve for any one of these reserves.
And is that a priority now at this point?
It is now,
It is as of 2018.
correct, and it's priority in statute, in resolution,
Right.
as opposed to a conceptual
With
priority.
a dollar amount attached to it.
Correct. A dollar or percentage. Because there again, as expenditures go up, $3 million was more than sufficient to meet our 3-month goal 10 years ago. Today, $3 million isn't even 9%. So today, our reserve for operating should be around $5 million. So that's why percentages are.
Fluctuate according to what is available, though. A dollar amount doesn't fluctuate, is my point. And then it precipitates cuts that necessitate having that dollar amount at the end.
It could.
For a mandated reserve.
That's correct. It could. And then the final one was to develop measurable outcomes for all elected offices and departments. Yet to be achieved, but put forward by the 2011 budget study of the League of Women Voters, establishes a goal for performance measurable objectives to review effectiveness and operational efficiency of budgetary changes, can be used by departments to review staffing level needs, and can be used by departments to establish budgetary requirements. So some sort of measurable objective helps in the in understanding the impacts of budgetary changes. Future objectives for the budget process. Prepare a countywide, we mentioned this before, these are yet to be achieved. Prepare a countywide strategic plan defining the countywide goals, objectives, and priorities for, these aren't departments, these are processes within the county. So public safety, the judicial system, general government, public health and human services, economic development, culture, recreational, and environment impacts. So these are functions rather than departments. And preparing a strategy that defines the function of government then pushes it back to the departments and the elected offices within the departments, within the budget and the county to establish priorities. So what is the priority for public safety? What is the goal of the jail and the process, the judicial process towards incarcerations of individuals? Is it to put them in jail, lock them up, throw the key away? Or is it a mechanism that offers alternative sentencing programs? Any one of those can dramatically change the budgetary needs of a number of departments as it relates to those objectives that are established. But those currently may not be written objectives. We have by default created objectives simply because of what we've done in the budgeting process for years and years and years. But in order to get away from the reactiveness of county government to a proactive, this is what I want to accomplish, and here's how I'm going to do that, requires an understanding of what our goals and strategies are to get to those objectives. Convene a citizens advisory committee. We also discussed this earlier to determine the levels of funding, unfunded and underfunded mandates. This is moving forward. The commissioners will be looking at different structures for convening the Citizens Committee, developing the objectives of the Citizens Committee, and within the next couple of weeks, we'll be coming forward to the citizens asking for their assistance and participation.
So you're looking at having about 6, we hear?
That's what I'm hearing, is about 6 plus 1 individual from within the county. And my personal hope is that we receive well thought through objectives by the next budget cycle. So this committee will be very active in the next couple of months.
Will this include members from the city as well, or is it?
They're not excluded,
Okay.
individuals from the city. Is it in conjunction with city government? I haven't heard that.
Okay.
But the citizens of the city are not excluded.
How will they be chosen?
That'll be up to the commission, probably in a, 2 individuals from each of the commission districts to be chosen by the commissioners. But again, I'm kind of jumping ahead of the gun here. The commission needs to determine what that process is going to be. And the last of the budget, or the objectives for future budgets, is to establish a Lean Six Sigma program. That's a leap. In the private sector, all of the larger corporations and all of the larger entities have all gone through a Lean Six Sigma program, which is to say, which is a methodology that relies on collaborative team efforts to improve performance by systematically removing waste and reducing inefficiency. Kitsap County went through a lean program in their building department to establish why it takes over 2 months, almost 3, to get a building permit. And there's a structured process that you go through to evaluate why I do what I do, why the next person does with what I gave them, what do they do and why do they do it. And it looks at that entire stream of operations and asks the question, why? Why do you need that report? Why do you need that information? Why are you generating that piece of paper? And you'd be surprised how things have materialized because of 30 years of history. People end up with reports that they give to somebody that has no clue what it is. That they take that report and give it to somebody else who takes it and throws it in the garbage. We've never looked at that. The state has offered assistance to any state entity, county included, to facilitate that type of an operation and a process. And I'm hoping that at some point we take them up on that and look at this type of a process. By the way, Kitsap County reduced their building permit time to, I think it was 3 days to write a building permit by eliminating 97% of what they do because it wasn't necessary. So each department can go through that kind of a process, and we can work smarter and not necessarily harder because we're doing things the way it was done for years.
The other way to do it is to cut an office's budget by 1/3 over several years.
That's the more
I think we've done that.
effective. That's one way of doing it.
Yeah, we did that to the treasurer over about, I think was it 10 years? Less than 10,
Yeah, I believe the treasurer's
Is-
lost a huge percentage. of-
1/3.
Yeah.
So I think that would be insulting to go to her and say, can you be more lean now? I really would. I mean,
Well, that still doesn't
But I
mean-
have to say, if you call the treasurer, you will not get anyone answering the phone.
Well, there's a reason.
Yes, absolutely.
There's nobody there to answer the
So
phone.
where's the service?
Yeah.
So either you want to pay for the service or you don't want to pay for the service.
The lean manufacturing training I've been through has included not only everything you are doing, but things you're not doing.
And
that
that's
would
why
increase
understanding
efficiency.
mandates and the gaps in there are very critical to having that information prior to doing this, because it's easy to understand what I know. It's much more difficult to understand what I don't know.
Well, good.
So improvements to the 2018 budget process, which is to define with the board guidelines to the preliminary budget, the general level of operating revenue, and thereby the base level of operating expenditures. For the 2018 budget, this was defined as 31,373,000. I'm an accountant, so I put all the numbers down. However, the preliminary budget was submitted at 36,473,000, $5 million higher than what was proposed by the commissioners. This is what led to the Lord of the Flies approach to budgeting. Based on the resolution that was established for balanced budget, the preliminary budget submitted will be closer, hopefully, to the baseline outlined in the budget guidelines prepared by the board. The final 2018 budget was adopted at $33,666,000, which was all $2,300,000 higher than the guidelines projected. But that was because there were additional revenues that came to the table. Specifically, roughly $660,000 in increase to traffic policing diversion. Do we understand what that is? No. There are two pockets of money that the county receives. Road fund dollars that are being taxed for, and then general fund dollars that are being taxed for. So there are two separate levies. Road fund dollars can only be used to maintain and to build roads predominantly. General fund dollars are there to assist the general operation of the county government. There is a RCW that allows the county government to divert road dollars to cover the cost of traffic policing within the sheriff's office. So those dollars aren't taxed for in the general fund tax levy, they're taxed for in the road fund, and then those dollars are diverted. Last year, those were $1,500,000. This year, they diverted $2,160,000 for an increase of $660,000. There was an increase in the sales tax receipts. Towards the end of the year, we saw that sales taxes were moving and continued to move higher than what were being projected. So they increased the sales tax receipts by $500,000. $600,000 was an increase in the Department of Natural Resources baseline. So what the commissioner started off with this year was, since DNR monies are fluctuating, let's eliminate that from all available operating fund expenditures. So we would disregard that revenue and say we don't get any revenue from that. Well, that's taking it to the other extreme. There is always a baseline level of revenue that comes from the Department of Natural Resources, which is roughly about $600,000. It never goes down to zero, but it can fluctuate from $600,000 to $3 million. So what they decided to put back into the budgeting analysis was that baseline level of that Department of Natural Resources revenue. $120,000 in property tax increases, $130,000 in new construction tax increases, and about $300,000 in other miscellaneous revenue increases. So what we started off with was basically where we ended up with, except for these minor adjustments in revenue, which then allowed the commission to go back to the departments and prioritize, well, you don't need to have this much of a cut. We could supplement your budget by these dollars, and they made prioritization adjustments to what was the preliminary budget that was presented in the call for the preliminary budget. Sure.
So should those revenues exceed what they predict here?
Then that'll go to our ending fund balance.
Right, and how does that money get dispersed? How does
It doesn't.
Who decides what department it goes to or what?
It doesn't.
What happens?
So if we get an extra $1 million
Yes,
in
exactly.
Department of Natural Resources, that becomes part of our ending fund balance.
I
And we've now met our contingency reserve by $1 million. So that then becomes the next year's budgeting process. And they may decide to buy vehicles with it. They may decide to hire staff with it. And that's up to that board. But it becomes an ending fund balance reserve. Improvements, following continued improvements to the 2018 budget, start the budget process earlier. Preliminary budget calls go out in July, and then September, the preliminary budget is submitted. The county has generally started budgeting workshops late October, where we end up adopting a budget in December. I have heard a push, and I would like to push as well, to to start the budgeting process as soon as the preliminaries are done. Define the budget workshop schedule early enough to have sufficient time to review with the departments their baseline budgets. In the workshops, review baseline budgets and segregate any programmatic changes proposed by the departments. So in other words, here's a baseline budget for my HR department. And I would like to ask the commissioners to change or to add a service within HR. That becomes a separate budget request. We had that one year, it worked very well. This last year, we veered away from that. And I personally would like to go back to being able to identify a baseline budget, a programmatic change budget, and then the final, which is a wish list budget. So if I had $1 million, what would I want? So we would have 3 levels of budget, and they can be put into the Munis system as 3 separate budgets, so that the commission can review them and discuss them with the departments and the electeds as 3 separate items. So in the budget workshops, review the baseline budget with separately added modifications for programmatic changes, and then separately review any wish list items, so that there are 3 separate totals. I have my baseline budget, I have my programmatic change, could be negative, could be positive, and then I have a wish list budget, so that those can be looked at independently. Currently, it's very difficult to follow, after meeting with 20 people, what their 3 different programmatic changes were and what their 10 wish list items were for each. This way, it can be defined within a system that is easily reviewable and transparent, not only to the commission and to those participating, but to the citizens as well. Continued improvements would be to utilize the information derived from the Citizens Committee to project revenue for 2019-2020 biennial budget. This would then set the level of expenditures the departments and the elected officials can expect. The committee's review of state mandates and funding levels of those mandates may modify the overall prioritization of the county budget. Hopefully, this can be completed for the 2019 budget. There will be no modifications to the accounting structure of the county budget once the preliminary budget call is made to the elected officials in the departments. We have on occasion bumped up against difficulties where individual departments were asking for changes in the accounting mechanism after the preliminary budgets were called for. That just complicates the process, and it makes it very difficult to manage that type of a change along with budgetary requirements. Last year, some elected officials did not submit budgets timely. This led to less transparency in the numbers and significantly delayed the entire budget process. Continued improvements would be to establish measurable objectives in the budget process. Objectives can assist each elected official and department by defining baselines of operational needs established by the mandates placed upon them and can be used to request increased funding. This can be evaluated by the board and modify their priorities of government and realign the budget expenditures. This can also be used to project staffing level needs and allow for planned staffing growth and not reactionary staffing adjustments. Continue to define budgeted FTE authorized by the board in the adopted budget document. That was one change that we made this year in adopting our budget. In addition to numbers of dollars defined under salaries and benefits as well as operational for a total budget authority, there are also budgeted FTEs in that budget, so we can look back from the future and say this is how many budgeted number of staffing levels we had in any one department. To review. You had a question?
I had a question. How important are grants in the revenue stream?
Fairly.
Fairly important?
I couldn't give you a number, I'm trying to think of Page's report. It's in the many
And to what
millions.
departments are they most important?
Various departments.
Various?
Juvenile probation gets a number of grants. DEM gets a number of grants.
Do we have grant writers right now that in each department, or is there? one?
Generally, yes. Each department
Particular
manages for themselves the grant writing process. We had hoped to be able to change that by centralizing that, and that became one of the casualties of the budget reductions.
Because I wanted to make a suggestion. You know, the state has an unexpected
Revenue increase?
revenue increase this year, over $1 billion that they did
Well
not
over $1 billion.
expect. Yeah, well over $1 billion. I thought that the grant writers should be aware of this and put
They're
those
working
out.
on it.
Because that's going to be really
So
important.
one of the parks has a lot of grants, parks and trails have a number of grants. They run through a grant cycle. It's basically every 2 years for the type of grant. We were successful in one grant, and that was in regards to the opioid abuse,
Right.
to the tune of, I think it's $300,000 over a 2-year period. But the difficulty with grants is similar to DNR revenue. You hire the nurse, you hire the practitioner, you hire the department, and then 2 years later, the grant goes away.
Right.
Now you have to decide whether or not to supplement that with current expense dollars or to have that project go away. So that is, there's a lot of decisioning into whether or not you want to go for a grant, because ultimately grants disappear. Public health is a prime example, and I'm not picking on public health, but they're a prime example. Public health gets numbers and numbers and numbers of different kinds of grants for different types of operations. I think they have upwards of 10 or 12 different grants. And as those grants disappear, the need for those services continue, or there's a determination to continue those services. Currently, the county contributes to the public health department anywhere between $350,000 and $470,000 out of current expense to supplement those needs, which were once grants that disappeared. So there are unintended consequences sometimes for grants. But knowing that in the decision to go for the grant is critical and important.
Who signs off on the grants?
Commissioners.
All grant requests go through the commissioners?
Go through the commissioners. To review, establish a budgetary guideline, develop a strategic plan, which is hopefully in the works, convene a citizens committee to review the budget process, understand the monetary impacts of state mandates, follow the balanced budget resolution, follow the reserve goals established in that resolution to increase reserve balances, and then develop a measurable outcome for all elected officials and departments so that they can be reviewed for efficiency and effectiveness. Start the budget process early, define the 2019 and 2020 biennium budget, have 3 levels of budget requests, a baseline budget, programmatic add-ons, and a wish list. Use those measurable objectives to substantiate budget requests, and then review those measurable objectives on an annual basis for efficiency and effectiveness. I know we've been asking questions all along, but are there any additional questions?
Frank, I'd just like to note, I mean, obviously a lot of time and effort has gone into this presentation, and I'm sure we all appreciate that. In the second phase, I don't think too many of us have too many questions about that because it has to do with more policies than specifics. But the first phase lends us to believe when you pick 2 points in time, at 2008, 2018, it incorporates a lot of not only economic changes, but changes that occurred as a result of not the support services management improvements to facilitate less people or more savings. And 2008 is, what, 4 or 5 years before even support services was created. I think it was created in 2013.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it skews the numbers a little bit when we try to get to conclusions about whether or not it was a beneficial policy change. So when we say that there's $7 million in benefits from 2008, or savings from 2008, 2018, that is not due as a direct relationship to changing or restructuring the policy.
That's correct.
Yeah.
What it's due to is the reorganization that the county had to go through in order to accommodate the state auditor's findings and to accommodate the, which was to restructure the operation. State auditor finding came in, I think it was in 12/13.
I think it was also, that's why I wondered why you didn't pick 2012 or 2011 to 2018 as 2 points in time.
Because what I picked was 2008, where we had a very high level of staffing, to 2018, where we dropped back down to a much lower level of staffing. If you were to pick 10, 11, 12, 13, there are too many things moving around in those time frames to be able to pinpoint in any specificity as to what the impact of, most specifically, the support services reorganization would have been. And when it was reorganized, one of the things that I recall in the conversation that the commission had with Bill Kenny at that point in time was that there wasn't a monetary benefit, but rather that there was an operational, structural benefit to creating support services.
There was a benefit in efficiency that would benefit the commissioners in maybe making
Managing
decisions.
their operations,
But
making decisions.
it's worth noting that reduction of 95 employees occurred basically in 2009. That's when we went.
No, that 95 is a combination of 2009 and 2017.
Okay, well, the larger chunk of this occurred in 2009 prior to having the restructuring. Just trying to give some sort of continuity to the
Two-thirds.
benefits.
Yeah, about 2/3 of the restructuring occurred in 08 and 09. So we had, I believe, the final number was around 33 FTEs that were eliminated in 2017 between the June reduction and the end of the year reduction moving forward into 2018.
The larger question, and really was the focus of the presentation, was the support services department and whether the restructuring behind that was a good idea, a beneficial idea that had good outcomes for the public. That's basically the question that always been revolving around whether or not the restructuring itself was in the...
That's a subjective question, but what specifically would you hope to look at in order to make that determination?
Oh, simply the measurable performance benefits of the time period prior to and after the formation of the restructuring for the supports services department. Almost the same thing with the title of the presentation is. So I just assumed that was cognizant when you put together the presentation, that it supports the reason for having support services, as the first few pages dictate. And I was just trying to make sure that that measure was used effectively to whether or not it was a good idea, or based on the benefits to the public, the savings, and the reduction in staff. That's the only point I was trying to make.
Does your notion of state mandates take into account court decisions? And I'm thinking particularly of the
Hearst
the court-
decision?
Court decision, no, not, that's, I'm thinking about the earlier one about culvert replacement. And
It would, yes.
okay,
So it would take into consideration state mandates under RCW, state mandates under WAC, and then any state mandates that are as a result of court findings.
or the auditor, I presume, or,
The auditor goes against what has already been defined, so they're not making up the rules as they go along.
Okay, okay.
So it wouldn't include theirs unless we had a finding that would
That's what
require
I was
us to do
thinking,
that.
yeah.
So we have a finding that relates to part of what I believe your next conversation is going to be, or your next meeting, which is to review the impact of the downgrade of the credit rating for the county, which is predicated on the fact that Belfair Sewer is woefully underfunded and requires a little over $1 million a year in funding in excess of what the sewer is bringing in. So it would take things like that into consideration.
Well, thank you so much. We have
Yep.
overstepped our time, but this has been a great meeting. Thank you so much.
And I
Frank.
apologize for coming in late.
No, this is great. Thank you so much. It was a little snafu.
Yep, no
Thank you
problem.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.